really looking forward to the conversation today. We've got some really amazing content topics that I believe all of you will enjoy. We've got some dynamic people who are not just, I don't know, talking heads, but practitioners, which, for me, I think is what most people are looking for, which is, how do I learn how to, we called it sink or swim in this, kind of current state in the current world that we live in, and how companies and organizations are thriving right now in this, I don't know. We're not using the word uncertain times. We're never bringing that thing back. I'm just going to go ahead and call that. So cool. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. We've got some great panelists. Maybe Melanie, Nikki, do you two want to introduce yourselves really quick?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mel, you go ahead.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Melanie, co-founder and CEO here at Skaled. We're a just-in-time learning solution. For those of you that don't know what that is, it's pretty simple. We basically are kind of challenging the old way of training employees, which was kind of like one-off trainings via webinars or LMS platforms, and instead putting that training in the flow of work. So your sales playbooks, your processes, your enablement can actually be delivered to the employee in the moment where they need it, whether that's in Salesforce outreach or other applications. So great to meet you all.
And I am Nikki Schanzer, based out of Austin, Texas. I am I know, right? I am the Senior Manager of Revenue Enablement at Outreach, and we are a sales engagement platform leveraged to streamline all salespeople's efforts, whether that's through outreach or forecasting or listening to calls through Kaya. So yeah,
if you don't know outreach, I mean,
I know.
I don't know where you've
I'm
been.
like, I feel like a lot of people are leveraging us, which is great.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily know all the things of outreach, right? Like you commit, and there's a whole bunch of other things. So if you just thought outreach was a tool for your SDR teams, you're sadly mistaken. There's actually quite a bit more.
We actually just rolled out to our CS team, which we're pretty excited about, because our BDR and our AE orgs were using it pretty heavily. But on the CSM side, we've really kind of taken our process to the next level by implementing Catalyst, which is another just game-changing tool for us. And now we have outreach paired with that to really hopefully, provide the best customer experience. So excited to be exploring that use case, because that's one that I've never done.
It is a no-brainer, Melanie. It is one of the ones that's baffled me ever since these tools came out in 2015, 16. I'm like, why doesn't every CS team use this? Like, you have to touch a customer proactively how many times in a year? Like, why not automate the reminder part of it, not the hit send all part of it? So,
and frankly, we're gonna get into this in this webinar, which I'm super excited about. But I think CS right now is one of the lowest lifts in terms of helping your team stay engaged, right? In terms of how do you protect your revenue and everything. So excited to chat a bit more, and that's a key part of our strategy.
I love it. There you go, Nikki. There's a plug.
Thank you. I didn't need to say anything. Thank you.
We got you.
I'm really excited about it. So
don't worry, Mel. We'll get to you. Don't worry. The plug will come there on the other side too. So cool. So let's talk about kind of state of sales teams right now. Back in May, and this is really cool. So this morning I decided to drop another poll to just kind of get the temperature. So back in May, this is like early May, I did a poll, and 69% said that nothing yet, business as usual. The organization we're not really experiencing. So 69%, there's 500 people that responded, said, nothing yet, no downsizing, no cutting expenses, business as usual. This morning, okay, very similar question. Are your sales still being impacted? It flips. 70% out of 422 people, that's a lot of votes for a few hours, said yes. 41% said yes, for sure, my sales are being impacted. 29% said a little bit. So now only 30% of people said not really. So here we are, fast forward 3 months, and things have shifted, which is why the conversation today, I think, is more timely than ever. And I think a lot of companies too are kind of thinking through, okay, we've had a little bit of like a rebound, but what's going to happen next? So I think that there's a lot of, interesting things that people are working through right now. So what I want to do is let's talk about that. If there is something that happens again, or guess what, if you've been around long enough, it's all cycles. We will have another downturn. Something will happen in the future. For both of you and Nikki, I'll start with you. Like when things turn for the worst, what are some common, one or two things that you see that, organizations either do immediately or need to do to kind of prepare for when this happens again?
Yeah. So I'll take the first part of that, which is what I've seen happen. And the context I'll provide is that I've been through this so much in the last 2.5 to 3 years at multiple organizations where, whether it's a layoff or org change or restructure or RIF, whatever the name is, and being on the enablement side, you're kind of looking at whether it's impacted our team or not, which I've gone through both of those as well. You're watching the revenue org shift and change. And what the immediate reaction is to those quote unquote uncertain times, or whatever we want to rename it, is panic. And that can result in, I would say, either a complete pivot in strategy. It can also be tossing a lot of things out there that they're just ideas. They're not fully baked a lot of times, and swirl. And what ends up happening is the sales teams or CS teams are starting to feel like, what do I focus on now? Like, instead of staying the course. And that goes to the second part where I think, yes, it's okay to try new things, but to try multiple new things is really hard on sales teams or revenue teams across the board, because the best thing to do is focus. And so where can you double down? Where can you get really prescriptive to help your teams? And then sprinkle in new strategies lightly because it's too much. And there's human beings on the other side of that are dealing with their own viewpoints and stress around it. So adding to that, just it's common, but it doesn't usually help.
Yeah. So thinking about that, like, spirit of experimentation, and candidly, companies should be doing it in the best of times too. Right?
Exactly.
Like, there should always be this, I call it like a performance mindset in sales, which I don't really think we have right now. It's very much we adjust things every 6 to 12 months or even more. Melanie, what about you? What are the things that you think about, obviously preparing your org, as you all, kind of went through this, what are the top things that you think about in terms of just, again, either making sure that you stay prepared or once things happen, making adjustments?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny the stat you showed, like in May versus August, because I think we had our board meeting mid-May, right? And this is when there were early signs in the market. And I think at the investor level, they were really starting to see it, but it was mostly the public stocks, not so much the private sector. For those of you that don't know, we raised $45 million in December. So our Series B. And the market over the last couple of years as a founder has been very favorable in the sense that, the expectations that were set in terms of how quickly you had to grow and how far you had to grow to raise that next round of capital just were much lower than what they used to be, frankly, to a fault, right? And I think that correction started happening more up market, and it took a little bit longer to be seen down market, but we pretty quickly, so we went into that board meeting. We were already starting to get pressure of like, hey, we might need to extend runway in terms of when we're going to have to go raise, because if expectations change to, hey, you guys need to get to this metric that's $10 million further than what we thought, that's a pretty big shift to our business plan. And so went into that board meeting. At that point, I'm like, hey, listen, we're not seeing any impacts right now. People are purchasing, pipeline's good, really good. And then I remember in June, it was the week of like June 10th or 15th. In 1 week, it was like, I kid you not, 25% of our pipeline that was late stage all of a sudden was like, we're on hold, budgets are freezing. Like, that's really when we started seeing layoffs in our customers across the board. And we were like, whoa, like, what is happening? That's when BDRs started, like, we have obviously Slack channels. It was like, hey, people aren't answering as much. Like, what are we doing? And so I was seeing all the symptoms for where I stand across our customer base and prospects and stuff. And so we did ultimately end up having to restructure at the end of June, which was an incredibly tough thing to go through. I'm a first-time founder, and it's something that you never have to to go through. And there's a lot of things that, in retrospect, I wish, I would have done differently with growing the team. But I think, through that process, I think what we really tried to focus on is like what you mentioned, Nikki, the fact that it's a human on the other side of the coin, right? And, whether it's the people that were transitioned out of the business or the people that were in the business, right? At the end of the day, it's not just their jobs that are at stake. Many of them, depending on their demographic or profile, have money that are invested in the public stocks. So not only are they seeing their personal finances get affected, right? Many of them also had just purchased houses, right? Like everything's been up. And they might have flexible mortgage rates, and now they're seeing their rates go up. I mean, like there was just so much pressure and tension that, we really tried focusing, at least in July, really on that human aspect. I still think that there's obviously more that we can do, but that was kind of the first order priority. We also started looking at, from just a pure strategy standpoint, like what industries do we think are going to be less impacted right now? Like we were seeing in that kind of SMB/growth tech, the most pressure, right?
Yeah.
Like as companies that thought they were going to be able to go public were no longer getting ready to go public, as companies that were planning to raise soon no longer had that visibility into when they were fundraising, and every company kind of going through the first order process before you impact people is like, how can we do with what we have today, right? In terms of our tech stack, and then what do we not need that we have today? And so it was just a lot of, we were going through that process ourselves, right? And so it was interesting because we were able to speak pretty openly. And like, I tried to be pretty transparent with our sales teams, like, hey, here's how I'm thinking about it. And here's how it's trickling down to my leaders. And here's how it's trickling down to their leaders, because that way they could have hopefully more educated conversations with our buyers. And still, I think that there's a lot more that we could be doing there. And so then we actually launched revenue plays that were specifically industry focused, where we knew that based on our customer base, we had a lot of success, really strong use case. And based on kind of historics and recessions and stuff, there was a little bit less sensitivity to the market dynamics that were happening right now. And that proved that was pretty successful in terms of kind of getting them some quick wins of seeing pipeline away from our kind of traditional ICP, which is B2B growth SaaS. So those are kind of some of the early things. But to your point, Nikki, like you want to start changing all these things, like, okay, we need to change our messaging to be more loss aversion versus benefits, but too much is only going to create more chaos to what is already a really chaotic period. So it's finding that balance for sure.
Yeah. And that's perfect. A perfect segue as we kind of, maybe get more tactical for some folks out there, because again, Nikki, you talked about not changing, we talked a little bit about changing, again, like the profile of our buyer persona, right? Whether that's the, ideal customer profile, the segment, or it could be maybe some, the messaging is different to different buyer personas. So let's talk a little bit about buyer personas. And again, and I'll loop together buyer personas with, let's call it ideal customer profile, just for the sake of this. Nikki, because you brought it up, I'm going to toss it to you. I'm also going to drop a poll here, which is just, have you started to adjust who you're targeting, whether it's job titles, whether it's industries? Melanie, you already talked about, yes, you are doing it. So Nikki, how do you think about that balance of like, what are the steps that a team should take in these types of times right now to maybe adjust who they're targeting, from an industry sector in particular?
I think I always take the step back approach of, do we need to change our buyer, or is it that we need to hone in our messaging to our ultimate buyers based on the change that's happening? So to me, like, if you don't have your messaging down, kind of doesn't matter not that it doesn't matter who your buyers are, but the messaging starts first. I've gone through IDP exercises with marketing teams where, which is great because you get the data to back it up. Usually it's a lengthy process. And so I love the argument of like, our Salesforce data is bad. Like that's usually we think we know who our buyers are, but we might not. When we're in this moment now, if we take a step back and go, how does what we're providing our buyers help them in these instances, and attach that to doubling down on who we think is going to receive that in the best way? That's always the approach, I feel like. And again, I'm coming from the perspective of how a sales team or revenue team understands this information on the back end is in their minds, they need to package it. It needs to be compartmentalized in their brains so it doesn't feel like new buyers, new messaging, new this, new that. And so I think that it's like, here's our core message and what it was. Here are the few areas we're going to pivot that. And here's where we can really help. And here's who we can really help. And if we're able to funnel that through, the sales teams and the customer success teams who are having these conversations right away can pivot a lot faster.
Yeah, I think that again, and Melanie, you talked about that use case example, right? Like of the messaging pivoting to this. How does that, Nikki, just a follow up, like how do you think about that change versus, like you said, and both of you talked about it, like not wanting to change too much? Like how do you, I guess, like know, right? Because I think, you definitely can have this desire, maybe you're, if you're a rep and you're listening to this or watching this, you might be thinking like, okay, like I want to adjust my messaging, but it's not enough. Like, I also want to stay the course a little bit. Like, how do you go through that exercise, of this, like, we got to pivot the messaging. Okay. It's more relevant to these people now, with also like, maybe not 100%.
Yeah. If it's thinking of themes, they're all there for you, whether you're in this moment or not. Like, what are the themes as to why people are purchasing your technology? And then how do you attach that to what's happening? So right now, we know that tool consolidation is a huge focus for a lot of organizations. And even at Hopin, I was going through these exercises of like, if this, then that, and proving things. And so from a CS perspective, you're wanting to get in front of those conversations and ask right away, are you actually, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, are you actually looking to consolidate? Because if we're tiptoeing around it, we're not going to get the answers that we need. Then from a sales perspective, I think back to your point of simplifying, I love like 2 or 3 things. Like, here are the 2 to 3 reasons, or the 2 or 3 use cases, of the, like, keep it as simple as you possibly can and start to test that. Even if you take pilot groups out of your orgs and test with them, like, if we don't know what we're measuring for and we're just tossing out ideas, it's going to fall flat no matter what. So simplifying, making sure that the messaging for pre and post sales teams are streamlined with the current existing conversations they're having, I think will help a ton.
Look, I think that's great. One of the things you said that I hope people listen to, talk to your customers and ask them what they're going through. Wow, like that's a novel concept. Like, maybe we should, I mean, by the way, that never goes out of style, my friends. You can have all the marketing messages you want and think you want to be XYZ, but at the end of the day, your customers, have a pretty big say in that. So I think that's a really great kind of tactical thing that anyone could take away. I like the idea too, just 2 or 3 tests, again, kind of how you described it as well, Melanie. I'm going to toss this next one to you, Melanie. In terms of, okay, so we started to adjust some of our go-to-market messaging. Let's call it like the top, right? Of like, okay, who we might target, what the tweaks might be. How do you make sure, like, as we kind of take this through the process, like, how do you make sure that your playbooks, right? Because not only do we need to be able to adjust this top of funnel, guess what else happens whenever times like this, get crunched, right? Where companies are getting crunched, more people want to get involved, more people have to sign off. People, like, they might look for some different things in the deal, or more proof cases, or, discounts or whatever. So, how do you think about keeping your playbooks, agile, and again, adjusting those to, times when things aren't, flying?
Yeah. And I'm going to answer that. I just want to put emphasis on what you said there about, like, hey, talking to your buyer and asking them what they're going through. We actually just did an exercise with all of our RVPs where we picked 10 discovery calls just out of there. And what I wanted to see is, like, what are we actually asking on those discovery calls? And what are we actually being asked on those discovery calls? Because I wanted to really get a pulse on, like, is what we think happening?
Yeah.
And the biggest kind of takeaway that we had there is that we were asking a lot of what I consider lay of the land questions. Like, for us, how do you train today? What are the gaps with that? Like, how's that impacting your team, et cetera, et cetera. What we weren't asking was the very simple question up front, which is like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, like, what are the top initiatives right now that you're focused on, right? And who's driving those, and why do those matter? right? And then being able to really tie, Nikki, to your point, those use cases and the value of your product to those priorities. And it's such a simple thing, but I just talked to our CS team this morning too. I'm like, hey, now's a really great time, even if you think we had a great use case that we're building, to revisit that with our buyers, right? And our customers, and like, hey, we know that a lot has changed. Like, let's just get a pulse check. Like, what are the top initiatives? And are those coming from sales leadership or executive leadership, or, and so anyway, so that's just something that we did in terms of kind of diagnosing, like, what is actually happening and where is there like kind of low hanging fruit for us to optimize. And to answer your second question on the playbook side, now that we've kind of identified some gaps in how we even do discovery to uncover and then tie the value, and Nikki, we're doing a big thing on messaging and personas too. Now we're actually embedding that in our product specs, because we can actually put that next to the stages and next to the different personas and titles and stuff. But, I think that your sales playbook should be an agile process. So whether that's a Google Doc that you're updating, I think the challenge with that is making sure that people are actually seeing those updates, right? And actually like validating that they understand it and are adopting it. We learned the hard way. We actually did not follow our own best practices and implemented a sales methodology at the beginning of the year kickoff that wasn't fully adopted in retrospect. And it's because we didn't follow our own practices of reinforcement, and we introduced a lot of other stuff. And so, for me, it really comes down to how readily available and easy to access is that information and that enablement to the rep when they're going to need it. And then also making sure that you have then the accountability system. So not only are we actually, changing up how we do discovery and then how we position the product in our playbooks, but we also have a new process by which our RVPs are coaching the reps on that using call recording software. And then we also are starting off, and this is more from a motivation, but basically on front, we have a Slack channel where we're going to pick one call a week and do kind of a live, like, let's all learn together and kind of like, dissect that, because it's just a fun group learning. And again, it's like, how do we all get together and like win as a team by like, every rep kind of has its own flavor that they can bring to that. So using that and then updating the playbooks and best practices and really taking an agile approach without it feeling overwhelming, I think is the biggest piece to master there.
Love that. Nikki.
Yeah. So every time I hear the word playbook, I think my first inclination is, how do you define a playbook? Because everybody calls everything a playbook. I think being an enablement, that's the one thing that I realized is that everyone was referring to their own version in their own mind of a playbook that they had seen in the past. Mm-hmm. And so I've gone, okay, well, what do we mean by that? And I think there's 3 things that need to be in place before you can build really strong playbooks, depending on your definition. And this can be based on whatever you think it will be, which is making sure that your foundations are set with your deal cycle, which is how much time does it take from initial contact to closed, and then renewal. Your deal process, which is stages and the steps that it takes to get through your cycle. So that's like the science of the deal. Are we clear on what that looks like? And is that defined? And the third, Mel, to your point, is the methodology, which is, that's the framework of the how that overlays that. And so that's like the art of the deal. And if you have those 3 things clearly articulated, even if it's the ugliest thing everyone's ever seen on a slide, or it's really heavy in text or whatever, as long as your managers, your RVPs, to your point, Mel, if everyone in the business is starting to speak the same language, you can attach those 3 concepts much more easily within a playbook. Like the messaging can overlay on all of that. And if you don't have those 3 things set, your playbooks kind of are like, they either don't look the same, it doesn't feel consistent. And personally, I think for any revenue team, they need so much consistency. So I know one thing that Camille on my team built recently that I loved is this concept of, what do you know, say, do? What do you need to know? What do you need to say? And what do you need to do? And thinking of those concepts for someone on a revenue team is like, cool, I got it. They don't need the dictionary version.
Yeah. And when you think about that, Nikki, just like maybe a quick follow-up here, how do you make it how do you infuse that, right? What I find is, and again, it kind of always counterbalances with too much change. How do you, and Melanie, you gave some really tactical ways that you all are doing this, I guess, infuse more agility into a sales org? Are there kind of, again, you talk like these like simple, like non-dictionary things, a great one. Like, are there other, because we've got a question here from Amanda, for example. She said, to that point about lack of adoption, would love some more quick tips on increasing adoption of methodologies, technologies, processes. I've got a couple of, kind of my ideas, but how do you think about those kind of, I guess, quick tips, or maybe what usually tanks the methodology? And so, Nikki, I'll ask that to you, or the methodology deployment, or whatever, the playbook deployment. And then Melanie, I'll flip it to you, because I know you've got a experience share there too. But Nikki, what are like the quick tips that you see, either lead to a higher likelihood of failure or success?
Yeah. So back to leadership. If leadership is not speaking the same methodology language, it will never land. It doesn't matter if they're not using it to coach. I think quick tips are providing coaching guides within your technology, or scorecards are really helpful to help reinforce through managers, whether it's one-on-ones, forecasting, pipeline reviews. Another tactical thing I think is whatever your communication channel is. I'll give you an example, and this is going to sound like it's it was probably one of the most fun things I've done in my career. But we at Hopin had a bi-weekly call, and it was called the Hop Line, and it was TV show themed. So we made it at one point. I was like, I feel like I'm a clown. I was like dressing up. We did a Shanzer's Creek segment, so I dressed up as David from Schitt's Creek and showed up on it. But we had segments like Saved by the MQL, and marketing would get up and speak that language, and enablement was there to say, like, are we talking about the methodology in the right way? Are we attaching it? We would have win moments that we would talk about that tied to deal wins based on leveraging the methodology, and then leverage our technology and what we could find that reinforced that. We had product runway instead of project runway, where product would get up and talk about the new releases and what was coming. And if usually after product announcements happen, it's a playbook comes. So we had to work in partnership with PMM to build a framework around what that looked like. And one tactical thing I will say is, so not only do you need your communication channel that's consistent, and it can be like a weekly, bi-weekly call, it can be email, whatever that looks like for you. But I do think that the tactical thing is actually figuring out how you can build for all and scale back to customize for audience when you roll it out. So if we had to think of every component of what our revenue audiences need, CS teams do need different things than BDRs or SDRs, but how can we build for all and then break it all down and reformat it for each audience so they feel like it's, and know that it's the information that's catered to them?
Yeah, that's such a great call out. Melanie, what about you? You all went through this recently, right, around adoption. Obviously, Spec-It is a great way because you can, in an agile way, change what, like you mentioned, happens at each step. But, from what you learned, what are the things that you would do differently in terms of, deployment, and, what are maybe the top, like, one or two areas that, you pinpointed as either reasons for failure or reasons why it's successful now?
I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, given that it literally caused me to start a company around it. So when it comes to adoption, I've got a lot of thoughts. And at the end of the day, whether it's a tool, right, a Salesforce you're rolling out, whether it's CPQ that you're now implementing into your sales team that's completely changing the way they do things, whether it's a sales methodology, like the one thing I always tell our prospects and our customers is, like, if you're looking for a tool to solve your tool adoption problem, like, that's the wrong mindset.
Yeah.
Like, adoption to me is like really a cultural thing first, in terms of like driving that. And when it's culture, it's people, right? So it's people and process. And so it has to start first with, like, one, I really believe that, like, for any big change, you need to have the highest level of executive buy-in possible, right? So your sales leadership, if it's a sales change, and ideally even your CEO, if you can, actually talking to the teams and talking about, like, why this is so important and why this is, like, how we're doing things, right? Like, I feel like they need to understand, like, the latest flavor of enablement, the latest flavor of XYZ. It's like, no, this is like coming from the top and all the way down. And then I think it needs to go back up where it's like, okay, the executives and sales leaders are the ones that are going to like get everyone hopefully kind of pumped up about it and like really like, hey, this is the way we do things. But to me, where adoption fails, it really comes down first and foremost to reinforcement and accountability. And the majority of that needs to be your managers, right? So the people that are on the front lines, right? If it's a new sales methodology, or in our case, these new discovery questions, if the RVPs aren't actually listening to calls and confirming whether or not habits are changing, then we're at loss, right? So I think it needs to start with the managers. I also think that like something that very few organizations do, and frankly, we don't even do this well, in my opinion, yet, is having almost like an internal champions board. This is something I did at my last company really effectively, where there are some people in your org that have a lot of influence, right? They're individual contributors.
Yep.
And it can be for a multitude of reasons, right? Super high performers. So everyone's always looking at like what that individual is doing and why it's working. It's potentially people that have been at the company for a long time. So they've got a lot of that like legacy knowledge on why we've won and what customers have worked and like what tips and strategies. Or sometimes you've just got that person that's friends with everyone, right? Like we've got those employees on the team that are just super outgoing and they're culture drivers. And ultimately, you know, if you actually look at the science of adoption, which there's very little research on, if you look at the factors that influence adoption, and I've got an article I can share afterwards, the number one is peer influence. Peer influence. The second one is managerial support. And it's a study that was done on individual factors. So it's slightly different, but it was done in Australia, but it really comes down to like, if we're seeing other people are doing it with success, I want to do it, right? If I'm hearing these other reps that are like asking these calls and crushing it, I want to do it. If managers are reinforcing it and providing support, it's going to go a long way. But if it's just enablement, pushing the latest flavor, if it's just sales leadership talking about it, you know, for a week, it's not going to happen. So I think like that's the most important piece. And then the question is like, great, then what is the process? Once you've got those people identified that are going to help drive and help influence, et cetera, right? And I think there's ways that you can incentivize that champions board, which you can talk about. Then it's the process, right? Is it embedded coaching kind of call reviews within a call recording software? If you don't have that, is it, you know, role playing that you're going to do for a certain period of time? And that we're actually going over our training plan today. Is it, hey, for the next 4 weeks, we're doing a drip on this, or we're like keeping it top of mind? But I think having the reinforcement piece is where everything breaks out, right? And that's why we see so often, whether it's rolling out a technology or a methodology, you do the big kumbaya at SCO or at, you know, whatever mid-year release you're doing, whatever training you're doing. And then it's like 6 months later, why didn't things really change? It's like, well, we made a lot of noise. We invested a ton of time and resources. What we didn't think about is that change enablement, right? Like how to make sure that following that change, we're driving that. So to me, it's processes and people first. And then obviously there's some technologies that help with that too, that I think can be really effective.
Yeah, don't train people on methodology on the last day of kickoff when they're hungover. That I will also I will attest to. That was my toughest crowd for sure. But
always I would argue, yeah. And again, we obviously do a lot of this work for companies, and so for us, everything that you said is spot on. And whenever we come in on the back of failed methodology or any type of change initiative, it boils down exactly to what you said. It's that, one, we forget that the frontline managers have to be the biggest, you know, cheerleaders and be bought into it. And whenever we deploy these processes, we train them first. They go through it 2 to 4 weeks before the reps do, so they can get familiar with the language, they can start to use it, etc. And 2 goes back to when you're building your playbook. And it's why like out of the box methodologies like force management and some of these are just not how people want to implement processes today. It's if the reps don't feel like they put their fingerprints on it and the leaders don't, it's not going to work either. Mm-hmm. So we use Tiger Teams or Rapid as a framework that we use. And so for all these decisions, the whole decision-making process, you know, the reps are at like key elements of input, and that there's at least frontline leaders at different like phases of agree. So, you know, you have to get the frontline people involved and then train the managers first. And then what we do typically is once the managers have went through it, when the reps go through it, we train the managers how to coach to it. So then they kind of meet at this like beautiful juncture of they've already been using it and practicing it. And so it's already starting to become adopted as a part of this. So those are my 2 kind of cheat codes for it. So last but certainly not least is, okay, so we've talked about, all right, economy's struggling a little bit. First, let's adjust messaging. Next, let's look at who else this might resonate with, or if it's a different group we should be targeting. Now we talked about how do I make sure that these change stay agile and that we continue to stay at the forefront and make sure that things actually get adopted, right? As opposed to just another jack of all trades. Because sales is kind of dumb. We're the only part of an organization that thinks that change happens with a 1 to 2 day training. Like, it's the most delusional thing. It's like, no. We just need a training on challenger sale. It's like, and you think that that's going to work, right? So hopefully the three of us have convinced you that investing in sales training for change management is a waste of time, effort, and a distraction. So anyway, I didn't say, well, Amanda, I did say sales is kind of dumb. I do think the way that we view change management is absolutely silly. And it's because it's what everybody's done for forever, which is like, whoa, we got a problem with our messaging. Let's do a training on it. Gee, come on. Like,
actually, Nikki,
you know, like,
not to cut you off, Jake, but Nikki, I remember when we talked on a webinar and it was probably a year ago. What did you say you named your team?
I'm like, what did I say?
We're change enablers.
Yeah.
Sales is essentially change enablers.
Like, I also said, not everything's a training. Yeah. I also said, not everything's a training.
Yeah.
Like,
not everything's a training. And you said, like, literally, if you're in sales enablement, your full-time job is change management. And frankly, I think that's something too, that like, and that's why sales enablement is tough. It's like, you're expected to just like know the principles of like adult learning and science of like how people actually absorb information and how to like deliver that in a way that's effective. You need to figure out like how to actually like empathize with sales and understand the entire sales process at the back of your hand and personas. And then on top of that, you're expected to be a master of change management, which in itself is a whole methodology of like how to incorporate communication, documentation, and all these things. And so I think there's a lot of still evolving and education in the world of sales enablement. But to your point, Jake, I think like the change management piece is still the biggest challenge for like every organization, large and small, right? Whether it's something as big as implementing Salesforce or a sales methodology to like, hey, our competitor came out with a new feature that changes the way that we need to position against them, right? Like those are micro changes, but they make a big difference in your day to day.
Yeah. So you've heard it here first. Invest in change. Don't invest in sales training if you have a change management problem. Okay. Last question here. So as we'll spend the next 5 or 10 minutes here. I'm excited about this one. Okay. So we've talked about these different things. Now let's talk about the people side of this, which is how do you make sure that during a time like this, you're taking care of our people, right? And I'm going to toss another poll out here, which is just, are you right now training your reps or upskilling your reps? I put around, I toss this out there as business conversations in particular, because like what you said is that like, if you don't know what these people are going through, very difficult to really resonate with that market in particular. And so, Nikki, I'm going to toss this to you first. You've been through this, right? You've been through 3 layoffs in the last 2.5 years at 3 different companies. So you've seen kind of what happens. We've talked about like the sales process change and some of the things that happen there, but what about the people side of it? What have you seen work in terms of keeping people motivated, performing at a high level through this change and through these types of times?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to the human aspect, to the people aspect of this, I think we have to, as leaders specifically, really understand what happens to people when this goes on. And one of the things that I think companies can do is be vocal about how they're taking care of those who are impacted. And I think understanding that people have survivor's guilt, and what that can surface into is if they stay at a company, they're like, why not me? Why was that not me? Or if something reorgs, if a company does a reorg, people can start to ask questions. And so understanding that first, I think really helps, because it allows you to get tactical about how you help. And that can look like, hey, I know I've had our team work together to provide more job opportunities and or like list out job opportunities and recommendations on LinkedIn for those impacted. That can be something that actually helps people get back on their feet a little bit faster. I've also seen things like for sales teams, it's being really clear about what now. And this may mean that I will say this, that probably one of the biggest mistakes I've seen is the message of, now we're going to do more with less. That immediately makes people be like, I don't want to do anything at all. It's a very polarizing thing to say, but it's, we are going to do potentially less with less, but here are those things that fall into that category, and we're going to double down. Throwing things at a wall is what we all want to do because everyone has great ideas and you just want to fix the problem fast. But there's a whole other aspect that is on the human side of things that you can't control. You can just give people a solid foundation to move forward on. So I think that from things I've seen is go well and not go well, is I think you have to kind of handle both worlds when that happens, where you're going, okay, how do we just take care of everybody no matter where they're at, and be vocal about it and be really clear about what we're doing, and also let people know that we see that that this is what they're experiencing. I would say that the thing that I think is the silver lining for a lot of people they don't see until later, which I've experienced, is I have grown and learned more because of instances like this in a shorter time than I would have signed up for probably. But that's where the up leveling comes in. You are forced to learn more and grow and upskill in a million different ways that you never thought you'd sign up for, but it does make you stronger. And I think you're not in a classroom to do that. You're not in a Zoom call that teaches you how to do those things. You just have to roll up your sleeves and figure it out. That's a lot of times the best learning. I know for me, that's been probably a lot of the silver lining from a personal standpoint.
Melanie, what about you? Again, how do you think about taking care of people during these times?
100%, Nikki. I think it's hard to really vocalize how challenging these times can be on a team. I think the biggest challenge is really that, like, when times are tough, right? Like when customers aren't buying as much, or when prospects aren't buying as much, or customers are like, doubling down, you start to see these rocks that you're turning over. And it's almost as if like these problems surface so many more challenges that have been growing, but in good times, we were kind of like consciously ignoring. Right. And I think like that's the biggest thing that I talk about with a lot of other CEOs and other leaders. It's like, it's not just that you're having to like, adjust to your point, like how do you do less with less or do more with less or whatever, however you want to position it. But it's really just the fact that like more does come up. Like I have yet to hear of a team that was just like, hey, we restructured and like everything was magical and like all these problems went away. It's like, no, there is a period of time where like, hey, if you were building the wrong things or prioritizing the wrong things, like that's going to come to light really, really loud. And I think that's the toughest challenge, at least at the executive level, is that like, if your baby's ugly, it gets real ugly quick. And it's figuring out like, how do you lead through that? And also really figure out like, what fires do you let burn? Right. And so I'd say that's like the challenge I see at the executive level. At the IC level, obviously, they're really on the recipient side, right? They don't necessarily feel like they have a say. They're just kind of receiving these communications, these changes. I think like my approach is kind of the Band-Aid approach when it comes to making really hard decisions and tough changes. Like, I think the worst thing teams do is, let a really tough decision take 2, 3, 4 months, because if you think the team isn't feeling it, you're wrong, right? Like speed is of the essence there in terms of protecting your culture and protecting the team in place. And so, I think my role as CEO is to really work through our leaders. Like I count on actually people like you, Nikki, that are on our team, like our revenue operations team, our enablement team, our frontline managers. Like they're the ones that are really, keeping a pulse on the team and surfacing that to me. I'm really working with our executives to make sure that we're prioritizing the right things, and like as much as possible, removing things from their plate. Like this is not important right now. And also driving alignment. Like that's something that I feel like I've had to spend a lot of time on, and we're still working on. We're actually doing a couple upcoming offsites where it's hard in a remote setting to drive that alignment when so much is kind of shifting at once. And to me, that misalignment at the leadership level is ultimately what really impacts the team from a morale standpoint, when it feels like different things are being communicated different times. And in some ways, like, it's inevitable when you're going through a big period of change.
Sure.
Right? But I think the more that at the leadership level you can do to make sure that your managers and your direct reports are aligned on what needs to be done and what's top priority, like that alone is a big morale driver. And that's something that I'm currently focused on right now. Frankly, I haven't done a great job of that. I actually had to take over responsibilities for my co-founder that stepped away from the business and R&D. And so I was like heads down in like one area of the business, but now I'm kind of surfacing up for air. And I'm like, I need to really work on alignment between our leaders, because from there, everything kind of trickles down to making sure that everyone feels seen, heard, and understood, to quote Amy. And that ultimately, we're creating forums. Like this morning, I did a roundtable with our CSMs where I'm like, hey, I really want to hear from you. Like, what's going well, what's not? And I asked this very simple question: if there's one magic wish you had from a process standpoint, what would it be? And like, if there's one magic wish from a product standpoint, what would it be? And I did that with our CSAs. I did that with our AEs. And like, really, for me, I don't have as much time to engage with them on a day-to-day, but just showing that like, I want to hear and that we can identify those quick wins is super important too. So I don't know if any of that is right or wrong. I don't think there is a key playbook, to quote playbooks in this time, but I do think that like really being mindful of that is the most important. Like being aware going into your one-on-ones of like really checking in before going straight into the agenda of whatever there is to talk about.
Yeah, I think authenticity is the word that comes to mind with both of the comments, that there's a level of authenticity that you have to have to your people. And it goes beyond just transparency. It's a level of helping people to still pave the vision, of what's going to happen, especially if you're at the leadership level, but also being very realistic with them about, hey, this is what's happening. Again, I like that kind of not more with less, instead less with less, but we're going to focus and go deep. I think that's definitely an approach that we've taken internally as well. So that really resonated. And, again, like what about the conference? So we did a poll here about upskilling. It seems like more and more people are investing in like also upskilling around business conversations, which is kind of interesting because in sales, it's like, I'm curious, like what the conversations were before, if they weren't that, but how do you think about upskilling reps? And maybe just a couple of minutes each here, how do you think about, there's the taking care of the people side, and then there's the, maybe our team was not ready, or we didn't have the right types of reps, or, we hadn't been training on them. So how do you think about upskilling, now during a time like this, or, maybe not even upskilling. It could just be like training on new things that are going to be relevant both today and tomorrow. And Nikki, I'll kind of toss it to you first.
Yeah, I think that sometimes in these moments, because so much, I love what you talked about, Mel, about like you're lifting the rocks up and you're like, oh no, like here's all these other things. And that's where things spin up. And so how can you, maybe the content is just reinforcement, but it's done in a different way. I think a lot about, from an enablement perspective, how do we surprise and delight? So the concepts could be the same, but the way we do it doesn't have to be the same. How do we make the moments more engaging? Because I think that there's people who in these moments specifically are just trying to keep their head above water. And so I think for those who want to upskill, it's a lovely thing to want to do in these moments. I find that people kind of retreat in these moments because they're going, I don't even know what to do. But I think the way in which we approach it, maybe it's more exercise-based, role playing. I've done things where we've gotten people's hands on virtual environments for competitive training. We've done fun competitions with people. How do we spark some different way of engaging with the people internally, and reinforce methodology through that? I think is a great way to upskill. So many methodologies actually do have concepts that allow us to have better business conversations. Until people know how to apply that to their sales cycles and to the buyer personas that we're talking about or talking to, I think that's where we can quickly make impact and give people new ideas.
Love that. Melanie, what about you?
I mean, I think a lot of what you were just mentioning, Nikki, in terms of like finding ways to drive that change, but in a way that hopefully is a little bit more fun. I think that's a big aspect too. So that's where like we're starting to do like live call reviews where we're all, and I mentioned that earlier, but the whole idea is like, how can we really create a culture of like learning and winning together, which is, and seeing like, hey, like we use course as a call recording one day, perhaps outreach, but like, how can we share snippets of like when people are like wowed by the experience, or like when someone handled an objection really well. And like, to me, it's really not only how do we, drive change from the top, but like, how can we encourage change from the bottom? Like we have channels on like messaging that works or outbound that works, right? It's like, okay, the BDRs went through a little season where like people weren't responding as much. Okay, great. Hey, this messaging, this new approach, I did this video, whatever it is, like, how can we kind of like create that culture where people are giving these, like, I almost think of sales as a toolkit, right? Even frameworks and discovery, all that stuff. Like, it's just what tools are available to you to tailor kind of your approach. And yes, like even a playbook, to me, a playbook, to answer your question, Nikki, is really like, here's a like known set of events and activities and processes that when followed tend to lead to success, right? And it's going to encompass a lot of these different things, like how to speak to different buyer personas, et cetera. But to me, the more we can like provide different tools and approaches, right, that ultimately don't need to be followed, but allow someone to tailor something, to try something new. Sometimes like just the act of like, I'm in a rut, I'm trying this thing, it's not working. What I've always been doing is not working. Hey, here's a new approach. And if that can come from like peers, I think that can be really well. So figuring out how do you facilitate an environment where like there's a lot of that peer-to-peer learning in addition to what you're trying to drive at the executive level, I think is really important and kind of similar to what you were saying.
I think that's spot on. And obviously I think you mentioned it too, right? Like from a stat standpoint, the peer, the peer-to-peer in a time like now in particular can just be so powerful, both from an upskilling, but also from a morale and team. And there's so much, again, like we learn from each other every day. And the more that you can do as an organization to facilitate that, I think it's more critical than ever. And so I think from both of your comments, I think that's my tactical takeaway is if you're in an organization right now and hey, maybe you're a rep, maybe you're on the front lines, you can do this. You can be the catalyst. This doesn't have to come from just leadership or enablement. This is something where you can kind of take it on yourself to say, hey, like, okay, I do need to work on this, or I actually think I have something to share. Start a Slack chain, start a group together. I think it's something that's very actionable for a lot of folks that, during these times, it's a great time to upskill. And I can tell you, if you are training yourself on how to have a business-based conversation, it never goes out of style, because as someone, who went through the economic downturn in the 2010s, and working for the largest job site at the time, I could tell you that if you learned how to sell effectively then and have business conversations when times are good, whew, you kill it.
And that's what, Nikki, you were saying too, like these are the periods of time. And I really believe this, like to my core, that like make you the best salesperson. Like you learn so much. And it's like the last couple of years were easier selling easier selling environments. Like that's just the reality.
Facts.
These are the times that you're going to get exponentially better. And ultimately, like when money is flowing, like it will be overflowing for you. So I think that's the exciting piece. And just one more thing from a morale standpoint, like for organizations, especially startups that tend to be high growth, lots of change, et cetera, like I think things like manager training tend to fall by the wayside. And you have a lot of new managers, et cetera. One of the things that we actually just recently implemented, and it's new, but we're already seeing a lot of positive impact, is 15-5. I know many organizations use a similar tool, right? They're kind of engagement, like basically it's a tool that allows you to do like check-ins and one-on-ones and give high fives. And like, again, it seems small, but what it provides is more structure to ensure that your managers are having the right conversations and one-on-ones and asking the right questions, and for people to be able to provide feedback. Like in one-on-ones, not everyone's comfortable providing vocal feedback. Some people are more comfortable in writing. And also if you just like, do you have feedback? It's hard to really get that, but if you ask very specific questions. And so our head of people implemented it, and like we are getting really amazing feedback across the board. So whether it's that tool or another, like those are the kinds of tools, right? Like there's a lot of stats, at least our investors told us, that like during periods of restructure, you should expect a 10% additional attrition, basically, just because like it's a lot of change. Not everyone's ready for the change, and like, you know, depending on their season time. And so morale is like so contagious. Energy, culture is so contagious. And like, so whatever you can do to like ensure that feedback is being surfaced, right? And that like it's being heard and it's being incorporated into your approach, I think is really important, because that feedback is being shared amongst the team, just not necessarily making it up your way. So again, small thing, but I think it's been a real positive for us.
Yeah, I agree. I think we've seen the same thing. We use a tool called Small Improvements, but it's very, very similar. We just implemented Donut as well too, which is a Slack app where people are having, we tried to do it once. It really didn't work because again, we half-assed it, but now we've actually seen a lot of success from it recently in people just kind of connecting. So Nikki, I'll turn to you for kind of final thought here. Sink or swim, how to make it happen. Final thought for everyone as we wrap up.
Just any thought. Wow. This is lofty.
Anything. Could be about coffee.
Okay. I think that going through this a few times now, I want to like go back to something Mel had said that I think is really important to reinforce, which is leaning on your culture champions, leaning on the team to pick everyone back up, whether they're the top performer, and some of those people will be, but to Mel's point, like sometimes it's just the person who's friends with everyone. Leaning into those people, I think, is incredibly important, and letting go of the idea of control in these situations. People are going to learn what they're going to learn. Some people are ready for it and they want to go off to the races, and some people aren't. And so how do you just think of how you can best leverage everyone so they're playing to their strengths in the moment for where they're at?
Love that. Yeah, I think that it can be like Mel, you know, what Melanie was saying too. It's like you want to do these things, etc. And sometimes the best answer is to not do that. And again, like, you know, working through your RVPs or these scenarios. So I think it's a great note to wrap up on, Nikki. So thank you, both of you. I think hopefully there's a lot in here, both if you're on the front lines, if you're at the executive level. I really think that there's a lot in here for anyone, you know, who's really trying to think through, okay, how do I not just survive, but thrive, you know, during these times, and, you know, to eliminate the buzzwords of more with less, etc. I think we've given a lot of tactical advice. So thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Melanie, for joining me today.
Awesome. Thanks, Mel.
So fun. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Super helpful. We love to hear that. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week. Implement one thing. That's all I ask. One thing that we talked about, go back and implement it. And I promise it will make an impact.